The city of Blackwood was a place that felt perpetually wet. Not from rain, but from a persistent, bone-deep dampness that clung to the old brick and the cheap asphalt, a meteorological metaphor for the rot beneath the surface. For Detective Elias Thorne, the dampness was just the final, unwelcome layer on a career that was already waterlogged. Elias had seen things, the way any 20-year veteran of a major metropolitan police department has. The kind of things that make you see the world as a thin, easily torn membrane. But what he'd seen in Blackwood, since he transferred to this dying, semi-rural outpost a year ago, was different. It wasn't the graphic violence of the city, it was something quieter, something that burrowed. The precinct itself was a joke. A converted two-story colonial house on the edge of the industrial zone, the brick faded to a sick, jaundiced yellow. It was supposed to be temporary, but in Blackwood, everything temporary became permanent. Tonight, the second floor was unnaturally silent. It was a Saturday night, normally the peak of the predictable human chaos, but the old house seemed to be holding its breath. Elias sat at his desk, bathed in the sickly green glow of an ancient monitor, sifting through the reports on the Holt disappearance. Just another missing person, filed a week ago. Middle-aged man, no known enemies, left for a late-night fishing trip, never came back. No struggle, no sign of forced entry on his dockside cabin, just a perfectly made bed and a half-eaten bowl of cereal. Anything, Elias? The voice belonged to Detective Riley Vance, a sharp-witted woman 10 years his junior, sipping on a thermos of coffee that smelled suspiciously of something stronger. She was the only other soul currently on the second floor. Elias scrubbed a hand over his tired face. Nothing. Clean as a whistle. No prints, no witnesses, no digital trail. It's like he just unzipped himself from the world. He tapped the photo of Mr. Holt on the screen, a man with a pleasant, unremarkable face that looked like 1,000 other missing persons. But the silence on the water, Riley. It bothers me. The water's always silent in the swamp, Riley countered, leaning against the doorframe, her gaze sweeping the empty row of desks. It's Blackwood. People go missing. We find the car, we find the clothes, sometimes we find, well, you know. Elias nodded, but his eyes were fixed on the empty desk across the aisle. It was Officer Miller's desk. Miller had vanished 3 months ago. No note, no prior trouble, just didn't show up for his shift. His cruiser was found, keys in the ignition, parked neatly outside a condemned logging road miles from town. And on the passenger seat, not a body, but a small, hand-carved wooden bird. A wren. The silence here isn't the swamp's silence, Elias murmured, pushing away from his desk. It's the precinct's. I keep feeling like someone, or something, is waiting for us to leave this floor. Like we're intruding. Riley straightened, a small, uneasy twist to her lips. Don't go full ghost hunter on me, Thorne. This place is old. It creaks. It groans. It's the building settling. The building settles, Elias agreed, his voice low, but it doesn't leave little presence. He walked over to Miller's empty desk. The wood was dusty, the in tray still holding a single, crumpled memo. He pointed to the top right corner of the desk blotter. There, pressed lightly into the dry leather, were 5 perfectly symmetrical, tiny indentations, almost like the pads of a miniature claw. They hadn't been there yesterday. Riley stepped closer, her breath catching. What the hell is that? Not a scratch, Elias said, tracing the pattern with a gloved finger. A press. Like something sat here, just for a moment. He looked up, his gaze meeting hers, a stark, uncomfortable dread passing between them. Miller's Wren wasn't the only one. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sealed evidence bag. Inside, nestled on white cotton, was another wooden bird. Identical to the description in Miller's file. He'd found it yesterday, tucked into the sole of Mr. Holt's abandoned fishing boots, back at the evidence locker. This one was left for Holt, Elias said, the silence of the precinct pressing down on them, heavier now. The first one was left for Miller. This thing, it's not just taking people. It's leaving a calling card on our turf. It's sitting at an empty desk in a dead man's chair. Suddenly, the overhead fluorescent light directly above Miller's desk flickered once, click buzz, and then went completely dark, leaving only a cone of deepening shadow over the empty seat. Riley's hand instinctively went to the pistol on her hip. We need to call it in. The state police. Now. And tell them what? Elias asked, his eyes locked on the darkness over the desk. That a local cop and a fisherman went missing, and someone left a toy bird and claw marks on a desk. They'll write it off as an internal prank and a crazy ex-partner. No. This is about Miller. And this whole station. He leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. And I have a feeling the next desk it visits, will be mine. Elias Thorne felt the familiar, cold knot of investigative urgency tighten in his chest, mixed with something new and sharp, pure, unadulterated fear. It wasn't the fear of physical confrontation, it was the chilling dread of the unknown, of a predator operating by rules he couldn't comprehend. Riley Vance had finally, reluctantly, gone downstairs to monitor the single patrol unit still on duty. Elias had insisted on staying on the second floor, a grim sentinel over Miller's desk. He didn't want the silence to have the room to itself. That he pulled a chair from an adjacent cubicle and sat facing the dark spot where the overhead light had died. The only illumination now came from his screen and the distant, buzzing glow of the hallway fixtures, casting long, fractured shadows across the empty workspaces. The wooden Wren. Elias placed both the Wren found with Holt and the one from Miller's file side by side on his desk blotter. They were identical, about 2 inches long, smoothly carved from a dark, dense wood, possibly mahogany or old walnut, with exquisite, minute detail on the wings and tail. The eyes were 2 tiny, polished specks of black, perfectly aligned. Why a Wren? He opened his laptop and began a deep dive, not into the victims, but into the bird itself. Wrens were common, unassuming. They were also known in some archaic lore as the king of birds, and their small size often hid a disproportionately loud and complex song. Then, he found it. An obscure entry in a digitized book of regional folklore about the Blackwood Whisper. They say when the Blackwood takes a soul, it leaves a sign to mark the territory. Not a large sign, for the Blackwood Whisper is a quiet, mocking thing. In the old days, before the settlement, the natives would find a small wooden bird, perfectly carved, near the empty space where a person once stood. They call it the silent witness, for the Wren is known for its loud song, but this bird is carved without a mouth, a promise of eternal silence. Elias felt a prickle crawl up his neck. A promise of eternal silence. The Holt disappearance was silent. The Miller disappearance was silent. And this whole damn precinct felt like it was being choked by silence. That he quickly searched the department's internal archives. Had there been other missing person cases where a small, carved object was found? He filtered through the last 5 years of cold cases. Case 07-194, Sarah Jenkins, age 16. Vanished from a roadside diner in 19. No body, no leads. Last seen, one small, polished stone fish found inside her locker. Case 03-121, David Peterson, age 55. Local hermit, vanished from his cabin in 17. No leads. Last seen, one small, iron key, not his own, found under his pillow. Not Wren's, but small, strange objects left at the scene of inexplicable disappearances. Not random. Deliberate. A signature that wasn't about how they died, but about why they were taken. That he looked back at Miller's empty desk, at the dark patch above it, and the small claw marks pressed into the blotter. He realized the marks weren't just a sign of intrusion, they were a taunt. This thing knows we're looking. It knows the difference between a random disappearance and a theft. Elias decided he needed to examine Miller's desk more closely. He pulled out his flashlight, directing the beam over the dusty surface. He focused the light on the deep shadows beneath the monitor stand. He lifted the stand carefully. At first, he saw nothing. Just dust and cheap particle board. But then the light caught something small, metallic, and taped securely to the underside of the stand. It was a microSD card, held in place by a single strip of brittle, yellowed masking tape. Miller hadn't just vanished. He had left something behind, something hidden and intentional, placed where only a thorough, desperate search would find it. Elias's hands were shaking as he carefully peeled off the tape and retrieved the tiny card. He slotted it into the external reader on his laptop and held his breath, the mechanical whirring of the drive suddenly sounding deafening in the echoing silence of the precinct. The card contained only 2 files. A Word document, and a single, audio file. He opened the audio file first, clicking play. Static. A low, wet hiss. Then, a voice, unmistakably Officer Miller's, tight and frantic, barely a whisper. "It's here, it's not a person, Thorne, it's listening to the silence. I tried to find its pattern, the desk, it keeps coming back to the empty desk, the bird. I saw it leave the bird, not a man, it's small, fast, the sound it makes." The whisper cut off abruptly, replaced by a horrifying, non-human sound. It wasn't a scream or a roar. It was a rapid, wet, high-pitched clicking, followed by a sound like dry leaves being rustled violently, and then, absolute, profound silence. The recording ended. Elias snatched the headphones off, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the empty desk, the light still dead, and realized the noise he had just heard was eerily similar to the frantic, dry clicking he sometimes heard in the ancient heating vents of the building. He opened the Word document. The title was, Log, the Blackwood Code. The first line, typed in all caps, was a chilling warning: they don't take the ones who make noise. They take the ones who listen. Elias leaned back in his chair, the glow of the laptop screen reflecting the frantic words of Officer Miller's log across his face. He felt a sudden, profound loneliness. Riley was downstairs, separated by an echo chamber of a stairwell. He was alone with Miller's ghost and the clicking sound that now felt less like a building settling and more like a massive, hungry insect trapped in the walls. He scrolled through Log, the Blackwood Code. It wasn't a police report. It was a descent into madness, written in short, clipped, almost panicked entries, dating back 4 months, 1 month before Miller disappeared, 120 days, hear it again. The clicking in the vents. High up. Thought it was just old wiring. But it moves. From the basement up to the rafters. Always stops on the 2nd floor. Always near the empty desks. 90 days, the pattern is not random. It's silence. The disappearances, Holt, Jenkins, Peterson, they were all profoundly silent people. Quiet lives, no drama, few contacts. No noise for the city to hear. The perfect vacuum, 45 days, I found the first bird. In the attic. It was perched on the file cabinet of the original Blackwood PD charter. Perfect. Unsettling. It's confirming the folklore. The whisper takes the quiet ones. But why the precinct, 15 days, it's the building itself. The structure. This isn't a lair. It's a machine. The brick, the insulation, the vents, they amplify the ambient silence. They harvest it. When a desk is left empty, a vacancy of human noise, the building feeds. The thing that makes the noise, the clicking, it's not the entity. It's the sound of the machine running. The intake cycle. I think I interrupted it, 3 days, I've been leaving things on my desk. A radio. Ticking clock. Anything to make noise. It avoids me. It prefers the quiet. I saw it tonight. Just a flash. Not a wren. Not a man. Something that moves too fast to see clearly, all sharp edges and dried mud. It left the indents. It's angry I'm not quiet. I'm leaving this log. If I go quiet, it means it won. Elias looked at his own desk. His phone charger, his loud keyboard, the constant hum of the old fan he kept running to drown out the silence. He was a noisy person. Miller had been too, an incessant talker. Yet Miller was gone. He realized the horror. Miller had successfully evaded the creature for weeks by creating noise, but by the final entry, he knew he had failed. Elias quickly opened a new document and began a frantic text to Riley downstairs. RL, do not come up. Do not speak on the radio or your phone. Do not make noise. Read Miller's log. I'm sending it now. This building is a trap. It hunts silence that he hit send. Now, he was alone again, facing the empty desk, the only sound the frantic tapping of his own keys and the whirring of the laptop fan. He decided on a risky move. If the entity hunted silence, he needed to make noise where the entity was. The log said the clicking started in the basement and moved up. Elias grabbed his heavy-duty police flashlight, the beam cutting a thick, blinding path through the shadows. He left his laptop playing a loud, continuous police scanner feed on his desk as a distraction, a beacon of electronic chaos. He crept out of the office and made his way to the heavy, metal-plated door of the stairwell, descending into the belly of the old precinct. The basement was rarely used. It was a concrete tomb, smelling of mildew, rust, and old decay. The single naked bulb at the bottom of the stairs provided just enough light to illuminate the vast, dirt-floored space used for storing ancient files and decommissioned equipment. The noise was different here. Not clicking. It was a faint, high-frequency whine, like electricity fighting to pass through dirty wire. And beneath it, a rhythmic, wet thump. Elias shone his light around. Stacks of old paper, yellowed boxes, and tarps covering forgotten machinery. Nothing. He aimed the beam toward a large, rusty central support column. The column was thicker than the others, and he noticed what Miller must have noticed. It wasn't made of concrete. It was a massive, ancient boiler, long since disconnected, now just part of the structure. As his light swept over the surface of the boiler, he saw it. Hundreds of tiny, pinprick holes, forming intricate, spiraling patterns, like a massive, rusted beehive. And the rhythmic, wet thump was coming from inside the metal casing. Suddenly, a flicker of movement by the far wall. A flash of something low to the ground, covered in what looked like dried leaves and dirt. It darted behind a stack of boxes. Elias froze, his heart pounding. Blackwood PD. Show yourself. Silence. The whine intensified. The rhythmic thump-thump inside the boiler grew louder. Then, from the darkness behind the boxes, he heard it, the horrifying, rapid, wet clicking from Miller's audio file. But this time, it was closer. Much closer. And it wasn't coming from the entity. It was coming from the boiler itself. Elias looked closer at the rusted surface of the boiler, the light revealing something horrific. The pinprick holes were moving. Not the boiler, but the dust and grit that covered it. They were vibrating, and as they did, a section of the rust began to flake away, not due to age, but due to something pushing out from within. A small, wet, dark object, no bigger than a man's thumb, squeezed out of one of the holes, followed by another, and another. Not wrens, but pieces of a wren. Tiny fragments of dark, polished wood, coated in a sticky, black residue. The boiler was not just a structural element. It was a printing press. And it was producing the calling cards. Elias took a panicked step back, raising his pistol, ready to fire at the emerging darkness. But the movement behind the boxes was gone. Instead, the stairwell door above him slammed shut with a thunderous bam. Followed immediately by the sound of a deadbolt clicking into place. Riley. She had been separated from him. And now, she was locked outside the basement with the entity that he was trapped below with the machine. She was trapped above with the hunter. The thunderous bang of the stairwell door slamming shut tore through the building, followed immediately by the chilling metallic clack of the bolt. Riley Vance, halfway to the entrance of the second-floor stairwell, froze in place. She hadn't heard the lock turn, but she felt the vibration of it through the soles of her boots. She knew exactly what it meant. Elias had been locked in the basement. Her radio, sitting on the only lit desk left on the ground floor, remained silent, a monument to the enforced quiet binding them both. She had followed Elias' earlier unspoken command, "Do not make a sound." A sharp, icy buzz suddenly cut through the heavy air. Her personal phone, clenched in her hand, vibrated with an incoming message. She risked a glance at the screen. From Elias, "RL, don't come up. Don't talk over radio or phone. Don't make noise. Read Miller's log. I'm sending it now. This building is a trap. It hunts silence." Seconds later, a file transfer notification appeared, followed by the full horrifying contents of the log, Black Forest Code. She skimmed the final entries, her eyes widening. This building is a trap. It is a machine. They don't take the ones who make noise. They take the ones who listen. Riley realized the immediate danger wasn't just what Miller had described, but the mechanism of the building itself. The slamming door hadn't been an accident, it was the intake cycle finishing its setup. Elias, by making noise and drawing attention, had forced the machine to isolate him in the press, the boiler room, while Riley was now left free to be hunted above. But Elias had also left something noisy on the second floor, his laptop, still blasting a continuous wall of white noise, full of static from the police scanner feed. Riley looked up into the dark stairwell leading to the second floor. The sound from Elias' laptop was loud, a relentless wall of shrieking static and distorted voices. It was a beacon of chaos inside a building starved for stillness. He hadn't left it there to hide behind. He'd left it as bait. If the Black Forest whisper hunted silence, it would be drawn to eliminate the loudest source. Riley had to get to that laptop. Not to turn it off, but to see whether the noise was doing its job, pulling the entity to the second floor, giving her a chance to circle back and try to free Elias. She moved with an unnatural lightness, service pistol drawn. Every breath she took felt deafening. Every creak of the old floorboards beneath her weight sounded like thunder. When she reached the top landing, the shrieking chaos of the scanner noise had swallowed everything else. But beneath the static, a new sound began to surface. At first it was faint, a soft dragging, like sandpaper sliding over wood. It came from the cluster of desks near Elias' station. She peeked around the corner. The hallway was pitch black, save for the cold blue glow of Elias' laptop. It sat there, a glaring, howling focal point on his desk. And then she saw it. It wasn't tall. It was low, hunched, moving with twitchy, unnatural jolts, more like a rabid rodent than anything human. Its body was a chaotic patchwork of dry leaves, branches, and ragged strips that looked like torn burlap, blending almost perfectly with the darkness and the stained carpet. But where its head should have been, there was only a knot of slick black wood, wet, twisted, clattering, a shape Miller had heard before. It was on Elias' desk. Its dry, sharp claws were tearing into the laptop, trying to smother the horrible wail of its noise. The screen flickered violently as the machine was mauled. Riley raised her weapon, sighting the center of the convulsing, organic mass of debris. "Don't make noise. Don't fire a shot you're not sure of. The gunshot will only bring its full attention down on you. A better way." Riley remembered Miller's final desperate act in leaving the log, his last whispered plea for someone to listen. The entity was preoccupied with the machine's noise. She slowly backed away, eyes locked on the thing. As she did, she felt an awful tug, a sudden cold vacuum forming in the air where she had just been. Now, it wasn't the noise drawing it. It was the space she left behind. The pocket of deep, sudden silence where her body had been. The creature's clattering wooden head lifted from the laptop. It didn't look toward the noise. It was fixed on the fresh empty patch in the air, that clean silence where a presence had vanished. The laptop scanner screamed with static as the entity lunged, not at Riley, but at the space she had occupied a heartbeat earlier. Riley sprinted back down the stairs, her movements loud and clumsy in the dead air. She reached the door and found the basement release, a big, rusted lever near the hinge. She threw her weight against it, fighting the resistance and the lock of the machine, her frantic effort creating a shrieking symphony of grinding metal. The sound she made was monstrous. A siren call in a graveyard. The creature, realizing it had been tricked, tore its attention away from the laptop's noise and hurled itself toward the piercing, ruinous scream of the lever. "If I can buy Elias 5 seconds." The lever finally gave with an agonized screech, and the bolt slammed back into the wall. The basement door was unlocked. But it was too late to run. The entity had already moved, spilling down from the second-floor wall and hurtling toward her with impossible speed. Riley barely had time to turn before it hit. The impact didn't feel like a blow, but like a heavy, freezing shroud of jagged scraps and debris wrapping around her. A single, piercing shriek of triumph ripped out from the tangle of wood and leaves. Riley dropped her phone and her gun, the pistol skidding across the floor. As consciousness slipped away, the last thing she heard was the wet, feverish clatter of the entity, not on her anymore, but retreating, dragging something small and heavy, a freshly made, silent trophy, back toward the stairs. The thunderous metallic screech of the basement lock disengaging was the only warning Elias Thorne received. He heard the KTTT of the rusted lever above him, instantly followed by a high-pitched, triumphant shriek, a noise of pure, sickening rage, that was abruptly cut short, then, silence. A profound, echoing vacuum of sound far more terrifying than the frantic clicking in the boiler or the static from his laptop. It was the silence of a victim having their noise forcefully removed. Elias sprinted toward the door, his heart threatening to burst through his ribcage. He yanked the heavy metal door inward, his flashlight beam slicing through the gloom of the stairwell that he didn't see Riley. But he saw the damage, the upper floor hallway was a wreck. Elias's laptop lay smashed on his desk, the screen cracked, the police scanner feed now nothing but a dying, wet hiss of static, like steam escaping a pressure cooker. The desk itself was covered in deep, savage claw marks, worse than the indents he'd seen earlier. This was not a taunt, it was a feeding frenzy. His gaze snapped to the ground. Riley's service weapon lay by the doorframe, a dull steel thing on the dusty floor. And near it, a thick trail of dark, oily residue, mixed with torn threads of fabric and dried mud, dragged toward the corner of the hallway leading back toward the detective bullpen. The entity hadn't just attacked her. It had taken something that he followed the trail of residue, his feet crunching on shattered plastic and glass from the ruined laptop. He found the evidence where the trail ended, not a body. Not a complete wooden wren. But a small, hand-carved piece of polished wood, a fragment of a wren's wing, tucked neatly into the empty space where Riley's ID lanyard had been on her neck. Her badge and laminated ID, the symbols of her professional noise, were gone. Elias knelt, his breath ragged. Riley had been a police officer, a source of official, public noise. Holt was quiet, Miller became quiet, and now the creature had taken the identifying symbol of Riley's very identity. It was collecting the silence of the Blackwood PD itself. He ran back to the stairwell, but the basement door was not the only point of entry. A small, seldom-used service hatch, leading to the air conditioning shafts, sat ajar near the broken boiler. It was too small for him, but not for the agile, low-to-the-ground thing described in Miller's log. He needed to find the entity's lair, the furnace where the noise was processed and silence manufactured. Miller's log gave a chilling clue: the boiler, it amplifies the ambient silence. They harvest it. Elias realized the true horror of the building. The Blackwood PD was the perfect hunting ground, a place of mandated silence, during stakeouts, reports, and paperwork, built around a machine that processed and used that silence. He grabbed the remaining fragment of the laptop, the hard drive was still intact, and shoved it into his pocket. He needed a weapon, not just a gun. He needed noise. He saw the solution immediately. The old fire alarm pull station was mounted near the bullpen entrance, a relic from the building's colonial past. It had a massive, heavy bell connected to the ancient electrical system, designed to wake the dead. It was dusty, neglected, and ready to be pulled. If this thing hunts silence, then I'll drown it in noise. Elias pulled the lever, the building roared to life. Not with a siren, but with an earth-shattering clang-clang-clang of the huge iron bell directly above the main office floor. The ancient electricity surged, making the remaining fluorescent lights flicker and hum violently. The sheer sound was a physical assault, designed to panic and disorient. Elias didn't wait. He followed the sound of the bell, running toward the commotion, toward the heart of the noise. He heard the reaction instantly. Not a click. Not a shriek. But a panicked, frantic scratching sound from within the walls, an auditory panic attack, the sound of the entity recoiling from the sudden, overwhelming noise. The scratching led him not to a room, but to an unlocked door marked, Evidence Vault, Pending Decommission. A small, heavily reinforced room located directly above the main boiler in the basement. Elias kicked the door open, his flashlight beam illuminating a cramped, metal-lined space. The air here was thick, wet, and smelled of ozone and something rotten, like old meat left in a damp cellar. Inside, on a single, bolted-down metal table, was the horror. Riley was lying there, unconscious, bound tightly with strips of electrical wire and sticky black residue. Her mouth was covered by a thick patch of the same substance, ensuring absolute silence, and standing over her, holding Riley's Blackwood PD badge like a trophy, was the entity. It was impossibly small, maybe 4 feet tall when hunched, its limbs long and spindly. It wasn't organic as he knew it. It was made of the physical remnants of silence, a creature of compacted, dried-out detritus from the building, rusty wire, brittle wood splinters, dried mud, and shredded paper. Its joints clicked and popped as it moved. The head was a compact, glistening ball of dark wood, resembling a monstrous, mechanical wren's head, still clicking in confused agitation from the noise of the bell. It looked at Elias, and its central wooden head split vertically, revealing not a face, but a black, wet void lined with hundreds of tiny, symmetrical, metallic teeth, the teeth of the printing press. And behind it, in the corner of the room, Elias saw the true, horrific nature of the vault. A towering mountain of discarded objects, dozens of police badges, credit cards, lanyards, and small tokens taken from every missing person case in Blackwood's history, all piled high and coated in the black, oily residue. the creature was collecting the evidence of noisy lives and storing them here to be processed into silence. The fire bell was still ringing, a constant, deafening clang clang clang. The entity was distracted, but its split mouth was focused entirely on Elias. It lunged. The ringing of the fire alarm bell was a chaotic symphony of salvation, giving Elias Thorne a crucial edge, a distraction against a hunter wired to prioritize silence. The creature lunged, not with the grace of a predator, but with the panicked, sharp movements of something caught in a blinding flash. It didn't roar, it simply accelerated, its composite body of dried refuse and rusted metal clicking violently as it closed the distance. Elias reacted on instinct, dropping low and sweeping his arm out, not aiming for the creature, but for the table where Riley lay. He grasped the heavy, metal-lined hard drive he'd grabbed earlier and swung it with all his might, not at the entity's body, but at the mountain of silent evidence piled in the corner. The hard drive struck the metallic mound with a deafening, echoing gong, a loud, resonant, purely acoustic noise that momentarily eclipsed even the fire bell. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The entity froze mid-lunge, its clicking head violently snapping toward the sound. It didn't seem hurt, but deeply, biologically distressed. The black, wet void of its mouth convulsed, emitting a high-pitched, strained whirring, the sound of its internal mechanism seizing up. Elias used the precious half-second of paralysis to his advantage. He lunged over the sputtering creature, reaching Riley. The electrical wire and residue binding her were thick and sticky. He frantically tried to tear the binding away, but the wires were too strong. "Riley, stay with me," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the adrenaline and the noise. The creature recovered with a furious, metallic snap. It turned, abandoning the mound of evidence, and focused its segmented, clicking malice entirely on Elias. It seemed to understand that Elias was the source of the sustained noise problem. It scuttled onto the metal table, moving with sickening speed directly toward Elias's face. Elias had no time to aim his pistol. Instead, he ripped the black residue covering Riley's mouth off with a desperate tug. He didn't want her to wake up quietly. "Scream, Riley. Make noise," he yelled. As the creature's split wooden head closed in, Elias found himself face to face with the gaping, metallic teeth of its void mouth. The stench of ozone and damp earth was overwhelming. In a desperate, primal move, Elias took the heavy, clanging fire bell cord he'd ripped out of the wall on his way down, a thick, braided wire, and jammed it violently into the creature's mouth, right between the rows of tiny, symmetrical teeth. The entity seized up entirely. The cord was coated in residue, but it was also a heavy electrical conductor. With the fire bell still ringing, a surge of raw, overcharged electricity was running through the whole system. The creature, already agonizingly distressed by the noise, was now short-circuited by the very building it inhabited. A bright, blinding blue arc of electricity erupted from the creature's head. Its body convulsed once, emitting a final, bone-chilling sound, a high-pitched, sustained echo that wasn't sound at all, but a massive, draining pressure wave of absolute, enforced silence that slammed into Elias's eardrums, nearly knocking him unconscious. Then, with a final, sickening crack, the creature's composite body fell apart, collapsing onto the table in a heap of splintered wood, rusty wire, and black, inert residue. Elias slumped over, momentarily deafened, gasping for air. The fire bell, though still ringing, now sounded distant and dull, the world muted by the silence wave. He heard a weak, choking cough next to him. Riley was stirring. "Elias," she managed, her voice weak but present. The birds," he looked at the inert pile of debris where the creature had been. A few loose pieces of dark wood had scattered. He picked one up. It wasn't just a piece of debris. It was a single, perfect, new wooden wren, freshly carved and coated in the residue. It made them from itself, Elias realized, looking at the silent pile of detritus. It was the machine. The whole building was its body. The silence it harvested, it built its calling cards with it. They were alive, but the terror wasn't over. Elias suddenly remembered Miller's final warning: they don't take the ones who make noise. They take the ones who listen. That he looked at the destroyed entity, then at the vast, terrifying pile of human silence in the corner. The pile had not dissolved. And the fire bell, though still ringing, was now flickering, growing weak. The source of the noise was dying, and the basement door, which he had left open, was slowly, quietly, beginning to swing shut on its own. The massive iron bell above the main office was sputtering. The relentless clang-clang-clang was degrading into a sickly, uneven clank, as the power surge that had fried the entity was now draining the building's ancient electrical system. Elias, momentarily regaining his hearing, grabbed Riley's arm. "We have to move. Now. The building's dying, but it's taking us with it." He didn't need to look at the evidence vault door to know it was closing. The thick, wet smell of ozone and damp would intensify as the temperature in the small, metal-lined room plummeted. The silence wave, the creature's death throw, had been a signal, a call to the core structure. Riley, still weak but fueled by terror, pulled free of the residual wires and stumbled to her feet. The back exit. The main doors always locked after hours. They scrambled out of the evidence vault, Elias snatching his pistol from the floor. The basement air was thick and heavy, and the rhythmic thump-thump from the central boiler column, the heart of the machine, had stopped. Now there was only the sound of creaking wood and shearing metal echoing through the floorboards above. The precinct was dismantling itself. They reached the stairwell. The basement door was indeed slowly swinging shut, the heavy metal scraping against the concrete floor. Elias shoved it open and they raced up the stairs. The second floor was almost pitch black. The remaining lights had flickered out, leaving only the dying green glow from a distant monitor downstairs. The main sound was the screeching tension of the building contracting. As they passed Miller's empty desk, they saw the floorboards buckle. A fissure, starting near the claw marks, cracked across the wooden surface with a sharp pop. "It's trying to reclaim the space," Elias shouted, pulling Riley toward the back hallway. "It wants the silence back." They descended the main staircase to the first floor. It was a chaotic scene of a structure under immense, internal stress. Cracks spiderwebbed across the plaster walls. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The air conditioning vents, which Miller had described as the creature's highways, were violently shaking. They burst into the rear office, heading for the heavy, reinforced back door that led to the small, overgrown parking lot, but they stopped short. The back door was blocked. Not by a physical lock or a deadbolt, but by a chilling, deliberate obstacle, stacked neatly in front of the door, forming a barricade from floor to ceiling, were all the departmental files, evidence boxes, and records pertaining to every single missing person case in Blackwood history. The very paper trail of silence. The file boxes were pristine, stacked with geometric precision, forming an impenetrable wall. It was a final, taunting gesture from the building itself, forcing them to confront the true scope of the horror. "We can't move them all," Riley gasped, trying to pull on one of the heavy boxes. "No time," Elias muttered, raising his pistol. He fired 2 controlled shots into the heavy, steel door lock mechanism. The loud crack-crack of the gunfire was painful, but the impact only bent the ancient metal lock. It didn't break it. The building was designed to be strong. Suddenly, the filing cabinet next to the barricade shuddered. The drawers flew open with a simultaneous clatter, scattering files and paper across the floor. Elias and Riley braced themselves, expecting the creature's return. But instead, the file cabinet began to walk. Slowly, scraping the floor, the heavy metal cabinet began to push itself against the barricade of boxes, reinforcing the barrier. The structures animated. Elias realized. The machine is still running, it's just repurposed the furniture. They were trapped. The main door was locked and reinforced, and the back door was blocked by an animated wall of human tragedy. Riley, however, spotted something vital. The pile of evidence boxes wasn't random. There was a large, empty space in the middle of the barricade, a single, box-sized hole where one file should have been. The Miller file, she breathed. It's gone. The last file it processed. Elias looked at the gap. The opening was just large enough for one person to squeeze through, but only if the flanking boxes were moved slightly. We have to go through, Elias decided. It's the only weak point. He grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall, one more source of noise. I'll create a distraction. You squeeze through and get out. Go to the perimeter fence. Get to the highway. Don't look back. Riley shook her head. We stick together, Elias. We're getting out of this silence together. Elias didn't argue. He knew the risk. He nodded grimly and slammed the fire extinguisher handle against the walking filing cabinet. The resulting metallic dong and the rush of pressurized foam was a loud, desperate burst of chaos. The filing cabinet hesitated, momentarily confused by the sudden noise. Now. They lunged for the gap. Elias grabbed the top of the adjacent box and heaved, creating a narrow, ragged slot. Riley squeezed through first, the cardboard scraping her uniform. As Elias tried to follow, he felt a horrific, sticky grasp on his ankle. He looked down. Not the creature, but the black, oily residue that had coated the creature was now oozing from the gaps between the floorboards, forming tendrils that grasped his foot with surprising strength. The silence was pulling him back. The black, viscous residue, sticky and cold, tightened its grip on Elias's ankle, pulling him down toward the fissure in the floorboards that was rapidly widening. He was halfway through the narrow gap in the file barricade, suspended between Riley, who was now fully through, and the collapsing, actively hostile interior of the precinct. Elias! Riley screamed, grabbing his shoulders and pulling with all her strength. It's pulling me. The floor. Elias grunted, kicking frantically with his free foot, the movement only causing the oily tendrils around his boot to constrict tighter. The filing cabinet, momentarily stunned by the fire extinguisher foam, began to scrape forward again, closing the gap in the barricade. Elias had one remaining source of noise and energy, his service weapon. He twisted his body, aiming his pistol not at the sticky residue, but at the main structural support beam located just above the file cabinet, the very beam the animated furniture was pushing against. He knew the beam likely channeled the building's energy or provided structural integrity to the machine. He fired his remaining 3 rounds in quick succession. Crack. Crack. Crack, the sound was deafening inside the small office, tearing through the air. The bullets tore into the old wood of the support beam, not penetrating fully, but causing massive structural trauma. The effect was cataclysmic. The animation in the filing cabinet ceased instantly. The wood, already under pressure from the internal collapse, gave way with a sickening groan. The entire section of the ceiling and wall directly above the barricade buckled and showered them with plaster and shattered laths. The black residue on Elias's ankle momentarily slackened, shocked by the overwhelming localized noise and structural failure. Pull! Elias yelled. Riley dug her heels in, straining every muscle, and yanked Elias forward with a desperate surge of adrenaline. His boot remained behind, suctioned to the floor by the residue, but Elias shot free of the gap, falling hard onto the back office floor. They scrambled to their feet just as the falling debris settled. The path was clear, but the price was paid. The silence was closing in. Elias, favoring his now bare ankle, and Riley rushed toward the back door of the precinct, the one they had failed to shoot open earlier. The lock. Elias gasped. Shoot the hinges, Riley. Riley didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed her own pistol, which she had retrieved near the stairwell, and aimed at the rusted, heavy-duty hinges on the doorframe. The old building structure was its strength, but now, it was fatally compromised. Blam. Blam. Blam, the sound was less shocking now, almost a relief. The first hinge tore away, metal shrapnel flying. The second followed quickly, with a final, shared effort. Elias and Riley kicked the door outward. The heavy, steel-plated door groaned off its remaining hinges and slammed onto the pavement of the rear parking lot with a thunderous crash. They spilled out into the cold, damp Blackwood night. They didn't stop to look back. They ran across the overgrown asphalt, scrambling over the chain-link fence at the perimeter. The noise of their desperate flight, the heavy breathing, the clanking of the fence, was life itself. As they reached the relative safety of the deserted, two-lane road, they finally looked back at the Blackwood police precinct. The yellow colonial house was no longer standing, the entire second floor had collapsed inward onto the first floor, the internal machine finally consuming itself. Dust and splinters choked the air where the roof had been. The only things left standing were the cracked, outer brick walls, now listing inward, and the eerie, glowing green light of Elias's ruined desk monitor, which had survived the collapse, casting a sickly, weak beam into the rising smoke. The silence that followed was immense, profound, and final. The silence of a predator that had hunted itself to death. Riley shivered, pulling her tattered uniform around her. It's gone. The machine is destroyed. Elias stared at the smoking ruins, the adrenaline finally giving way to a bone-deep exhaustion. He looked down at his sock-covered ankle, at the raw, burning skin where the black residue had been. He hadn't just escaped. He had killed the machine, but not the code. The machine is gone, Elias corrected, his voice flat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the hard drive from his laptop, the only surviving piece of equipment. But the Blackwood code is still here. And the silence is everywhere. He turned away from the ruins. They had escaped the precinct, but they had entered the quiet, empty streets of Blackwood, a town filled with silent people, ripe for the picking. Elias and Riley stumbled down the cracked asphalt road, away from the skeletal remains of the Blackwood police precinct. The air was cold, the silence of the night wrapping around them like a shroud far heavier than the precinct's manufactured quiet. This was the natural silence of Blackwood, a town that had learned to be still. They walked for a mile before stopping by a derelict gas station, the perfect metaphor for the town's decline. Its fluorescent sign was dark, and the windows were boarded up with plywood that had turned green with moss. Elias slumped against a rusting air pump, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He pulled the hard drive from his pocket, its cold metal a grim comfort. The logs, Riley said, her voice barely above a whisper, echoing the caution that had saved their lives. Miller's log. It said the entity took the quiet ones. But why the police station? The machine needed a steady supply of silence, and a place to process the evidence, Elias explained, rubbing his sore ankle. We're better than a police department. Hours of late-night paperwork, officers out on solo patrol, filing systems full of cold cases, all that human noise packaged and contained. It was a factory. He stared at the hard drive. But Miller also said, the machine is running. It's just repurposed the furniture. That means the core mechanism wasn't the building itself, but the code that animated it. The thing we killed was just the main executioner. He knew they couldn't call for help. Who would believe them? They were two battered, bloodied officers reporting that their police station was a sentient silence harvesting machine. They were the only ones who knew the rules of the game. We need to know what happens to the files it collects, Riley insisted, her gaze fixed on the dark shapes of the surrounding houses. Where does the silence go after it's processed? Elias remembered the massive, horrific pile of badges and IDs in the evidence vault, now buried under tons of rubble. The entity wasn't just killing people, it was eliminating the evidence of their lives, converting their identity and noise into the raw material for the wooden wrens. "We have to go to the Blackwood Historical Society," Elias said, making a sudden decision. Miller found the first wren in the attic, near the original PD charter. "This thing is tied to the town's history. It's not just a creature, it's a centuries-old protection mechanism that went rogue." They started walking again, sticking to the center of the road, avoiding the dark, silent lawns and houses. The town itself was unnervingly still. No porch lights, no barking dogs, no distant traffic. Just the wet, heavy air and the sound of their own footsteps. As they passed a small, well-maintained park, the only sign of life in the decaying town, Riley stopped dead, pointing to a picnic table near a rusted swing set. "Elias. Look." On the smooth wooden surface of the table, illuminated by the faint, diffused light of the distant moon, was a sight that chilled them to the bone. Dozens of small, perfectly carved wooden wrens. They weren't haphazardly scattered. They were arranged in a wide, intricate circle, each bird facing inward toward the center of the table. They looked like a miniature, silent jury. "It's a nest," Elias whispered, pulling his pistol again, though he knew a bullet was useless against a carved bird. "Or a storage unit. The main factory is destroyed, but the product is still circulating." He approached the table, his movements slow and cautious. He ran his fingers over one of the wrens. It was dry, cold, and flawless, but in the center of the circle, where the focus of the birds converged, was not another wren, but a single, pristine white object. Riley Vance's missing police ID badge. It was lying flat on the wood, clean and untouched, placed there as an obvious trophy and a declaration. The entity hadn't destroyed her badge in the precinct, it had merely taken it and brought it to the secondary storage location before the structure collapsed. Riley stared at the badge, a knot of dread twisting her face. It was waiting for us. It knew the precinct was going down. It moved the evidence. Elias quickly examined the area. The wrens, the badge, the deep, unnatural quiet of the park. It felt like a bomb set to detonate. Then, he heard it. Not a click, not a scratch, but a low, sustained hum coming from the base of the swing set. It was the same high-frequency whine he had heard in the precinct basement, only quieter. Elias followed the sound to the thick metal post of the swing set. The metal was cool to the touch, but vibrating almost imperceptibly. He shone his light on the ground around the base, embedded into the damp earth, surrounding the swing set post, were hundreds of small, metallic wires and shards of what looked like broken glass and electronic components, the discarded remnants of the creature's construction, forming a tight circle. The secondary machine was here. Not a house, but a simple, open-air structure. The wires and metal were drawing in the ambient silence of the town, powering the new machine, and the wooden wrens were its antennae. Elias looked at the badge, then at the humming swing set. It didn't just take the badge, Riley. It was setting up the next stage. The silence is now active, outside the building. And it left you a personal gift. Suddenly, the lights flickered to life in the nearest house, a bright, blinding flash of pure, loud electrical noise. Elias and Riley spun around, raising their weapons. But the light was coming from a simple, domestic source, a man in his kitchen, having just flipped the main breaker. The man, middle-aged and wearing a bathrobe, stood framed in the sudden light, rubbing his sleepy eyes. He was too loud, too present, too noisy, and in the very instant that the light flared, the humming from the swing set intensified, and every single wooden wren on the picnic table simultaneously turned its head, not toward Elias and Riley, but toward the bright, noisy house. The sudden, blinding flash of light from the neighboring house acted like a dinner bell. Every wooden wren on the picnic table simultaneously snapped its gaze towards the noisy, brightly lit kitchen. The humming from the swing set intensified, a high-pitched, almost ultrasonic frequency that made Elias's teeth ache. "He's too loud," Riley hissed, shoving her badge into her pocket. "It's targeting the biggest disruption to the silence." The man in the bathrobe, oblivious, yawned and reached for a kettle. He was making noise, he was making light, and he was drawing the attention of dozens of silent, wooden sentinels. Elias knew they had seconds. The creature they had killed was the central processor, but the Blackwood Code, the animation that turned silence into hunting power, was still active, dispersed into the wrens and the electrified wire base of the swing set. "We have to stop the noise," Elias yelled, already sprinting towards the park boundary. "Riley, cover me. Get to the house and try to cut the main power." Riley broke left, heading for the shadows of the neighboring yard, seeking the house's electrical box. Elias ran full tilt back toward the picnic table and the swing set, his goal the core of the secondary machine, the dense cluster of wires and metallic shards at the base of the swing set post. As he closed in, the wrens reacted. They didn't fly, but the entire circle of wooden birds began to vibrate violently, producing a low, rhythmic thrumming sound, the prelude to the entity's attack cycle. From the surrounding trees and shrubs, Elias saw movement. Not the full, shambling body of the original entity, but smaller, faster shapes. They looked like miniature versions of the creature, clumps of dry leaves, twigs, and small shards of metal, all bound together by the black, oily residue. They scuttled out of the shadows, drawn by the humming machine and focused on eliminating Elias, the loud, central threat. That he aimed his pistol at the nearest miniature entity, a thing no bigger than a raccoon, and fired. Crack, the tiny creature exploded into a puff of wood splinters and dry leaves. But the gunfire merely excited the others. More of the small, twig and mud constructs poured from the darkness. Elias pivoted, grabbing the heavy, iron chain of the swing set. He yanked it violently, tearing the entire swing set structure from the ground with a screech of rusted metal. The dense core of wires and shards at the base ripped free from the soil. The humming stopped instantly. The vibrating wrens on the table went still, the small, rushing entities froze mid-scuttle, confused and inert. Elias had neutralized the power source. But he was now standing exposed in the center of the park, holding a large, metal weapon, still illuminated by the single, bright kitchen light that he looked over at the house. Riley was by the electrical box, grappling with the rusty lever. The man inside, alerted by the gunfire, opened his kitchen window and stuck his head out. He was yelling, "What in God's name is going on out there? I'm calling the police." His voice was loud, panicked, and direct, a perfect new target. The dozens of wooden wrens on the picnic table, no longer powered by the swing set, began to stir on their own. They started to fall off the table, not in a scatter, but in a coordinated, slow-motion cascade, rolling and tumbling directly toward the noisy house. They were moving by pure, harnessed ambient silence now, drawn to the loud man. Riley finally yanked the main breaker. The kitchen light snapped off, plunging the house and the whole area into darkness. The man's loud voice cut off instantly as his panic turned to confusion. Elias used the sudden shift in light to his advantage. He ran to the picnic table, grabbing a handful of the inert, cold wooden wrens. He didn't know why, but he felt an instinctual need to collect the evidence. That he looked at the house. The man was safe, at least for the moment. But the code was still active. Suddenly, a faint, rhythmic sound began to emerge from the darkness of the street, a low, rhythmic, almost ceremonial thud. 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 It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was the heavy, deliberate footfalls of an approaching presence. Riley ran back to Elias, breathing heavily. "Elias, that's not the wrens. That's big. It's coming from the highway." Elias looked at the hard drive in his hand. He had Miller's code. He had the Wren's. He knew the machine was gone. But something else was moving. The code is evolving, Elias whispered, watching the shadows at the end of the street. If the main processor is dead, then the silence itself is looking for a new executioner. He knew exactly what the heavy, deliberate steps meant. It wasn't the small, fast creature. It was a person, moving with the heavy, unhurried certainty of something that was no longer themselves, and then he saw it. A figure, impossibly tall and slender, emerging from the gloom. It was wearing a uniform, Officer Miller's uniform. Its face was turned down, obscured by the shadows of a police cap, but its walk was too slow, too heavy, too silent that in its hand, it held not a weapon, but the large, ancient, iron fire bell that had shattered off the precinct wall, dragging it along the asphalt. Thud. 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 The methodical, heavy thud. Thud. Thud, of the approaching figure felt less like footsteps and more like a grim, metallic heartbeat echoing in the silent town. Officer Miller emerged fully into the moonlight at the street's end. He was impossibly tall and gaunt, his uniform hanging loosely on a frame that seemed too rigid, too perfect. His head was still bowed, the shadow of his cap obscuring his face, but his movements were what chilled them. Every step was a pause, a slow, deliberate lift, and then the heavy, unforgiving thud as the iron fire bell he dragged scraped and banged against the asphalt. That he was moving with the slow, controlled pace of the code's old machine, prioritizing silence and presence over speed. Miller, Riley whispered, her pistol shaking. It's him. But, he's dead. He's a host now, Elias corrected, his voice tight. He remembered Miller's final warning, they take the ones who listen. Miller, who had obsessively listened to the silence, who had documented the creature, was the perfect vessel. The possessed Miller stopped about 50 yards away. The thudding ceased. The silence returned, thick and absolute, save for the ragged sound of Elias and Riley's breathing. Slowly, agonizingly, Miller lifted his head, his eyes were gone. Where the familiar warmth of his gaze should have been, there were only two perfectly spherical, black voids, like the creature's mouth, but smooth and reflecting no light. A single, thin, black residue tear marked one cheek. That he didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply stood, the human embodiment of absolute silence. Elias glanced at the iron fire bell lying next to Miller's foot. It was the only remaining source of significant, concentrated noise from the machine. The code had salvaged its main weapon. It knows the rules, Elias murmured to Riley. It knows we fight with noise. It kept the bell. Miller shifted. Not in a quick, threatening motion, but with the subtle rotation of a turret. He extended a hand, pointing a single, gloved finger not at them, but at Elias's hand, where he clutched the hard drive containing Miller's noisy, written code logs. The code wants its noisy data back. The hard drive, Elias realized. It's the loudest thing left. 1,000 pages of noise in its heart. The possessed Miller took his first step, and the code moved with him. The rusty chain of the fire bell was lifted, and with a terrible, silent effort, Miller swung the heavy bell outward. It wasn't a reckless swing, but a slow, deliberate pendulum, a threat designed to intimidate them into silence. We can't shoot him, Riley, Elias said, leveling his pistol but not aiming to fire. It's Miller. Then we make noise, Riley said, understanding. She ran toward the nearby abandoned gas station, looking for anything that would clang, shatter, or screech. Elias took a deep breath, clutching the hard drive like a grenade. His only weapon against a man who was now the very essence of silence was data. Miller. You wrote this. Elias roared, his voice cracking the heavy silence. He held up the hard drive. You documented it. You were trying to warn us. Don't let it take you. The possessed Miller paused. The black voids of his eyes seemed to focus on the hard drive. A sound finally escaped him, not a word, but a high-pitched, strained whir, like the creature's death throe, a biological shriek of denial. The code was fighting its host. Elias saw his chance. Miller was focused on the evidence of noise that he sprinted forward, yelling every noise he could think of, a primal, raw shout against the quiet. He ran directly toward the still, unmoving form of his former colleague. Miller reacted by raising his other hand. This time, it wasn't a gesture of threat, but a gesture of reprimand. The hand clamped over his own mouth, an expression of the code's ultimate goal, enforced silence, but as he did so, he stepped back, dragging the fire bell. The heavy iron bell, in its slow, wide arc, crashed violently into the side of the abandoned gas pump. The resulting sound was a massive, violent clang that echoed off the empty buildings. The noise, so close to the possessed host, had the same effect as the gong in the precinct basement. Miller froze. His hands dropped. The fire bell clattered to the ground. The black voids of his eyes flickered, and for a terrifying, painful moment, the familiar, human confusion of Officer Miller seemed to return. Elias. The man choked out, his voice weak, a dry, dusty whisper. I'm sorry, Miller, Elias yelled, knowing this was his only chance. That he didn't hesitate. He swung his arm back and hurled the hard drive with every ounce of strength he had left. He threw it directly at Miller's face, aiming for the black, silent voids where his eyes should have been. The hard drive, packed with the noise of the code logs, struck the possessed host directly between the eyes with a sharp, sickening crack. The impact wasn't a final blow. It was a short circuit. The metal disc shattered against Miller's forehead. A blinding blue arc of raw, electrical energy erupted from his skin, accompanied by a sound that wasn't sound at all, a final, draining pressure wave of absolute, perfect silence that slammed into Elias and Riley, knocking them to the ground. When the wave passed, Elias struggled up, his ears ringing and the world muted. Miller was on his knees, motionless. The black residue had evaporated, leaving behind only the pallor of a dead man's skin. The black voids in his eyes were gone, replaced by the familiar, sightless stare of death. He was silent. Finally, irrevocably silent, Elias stared at the body of his friend, and then at the shattered remains of the hard drive. They had killed the code's host, the last flicker of the machine, but as the ringing in their ears subsided, a new sound, soft and gentle, reached them. It was the faintest sound of birds chirping in the distance, a morning sound. Dawn was breaking. The nightmare was over. Or was it? Elias looked at Riley, both of them alive, both of them silent, and both of them carrying the weight of the Blackwood Code. The chirping of the birds intensified with the rising sun, the familiar sounds of morning asserting themselves against the long night of terror. The world was suddenly vibrant, noisy, and dangerously normal. Elias and Riley stood over the body of Officer Miller, the silence around his form the most profound they had ever encountered. The code was gone, but the emptiness it left was vast. They spent the next hour working with grim efficiency, driven by the absolute necessity of the cover-up. They were operating not as police officers, but as survivors dismantling a biological quarantine. They radioed in a total structure collapse, due to catastrophic electrical and boiler failure, fabricating a story of how Miller had rushed back to the precinct and been killed by falling debris during an attempted rescue. The story was thin, but in the desolate state of Blackwood, no one would ask too many questions. The department had burned down, all evidence, paper trails, and witnesses were buried under rubble. They carefully moved Miller's body, placing it near the ruins of the precinct where the debris had been heaviest. They ensured the fire bell was buried deep in the rubble. They gathered every last wooden wren from the park, every shard of the hard drive, and every trace of the black residue, placing it all into a single, specialized hazardous materials BAG.By the time the state police arrived, alerted by the distant, dying alarm and the fabricated radio call, Elias and Riley were sitting on the curb, covered in soot and blood, looking like exhausted heroes. They spoke in short, clipped sentences, answering questions with the practiced, emotionless flatness of trauma victims. They knew they couldn't be loud, the code was gone, but the fear of noise was now deeply, chemically wired into their survival instinct. The chirping birds, the approaching sirens, the loud, clumsy voices of the arriving state troopers, all of it made them flinch, their senses screaming that this level of sound was a declaration of war. The immediate aftermath was a blur of interviews, debriefings, and medical evaluations. Elias was treated for severe bruising and nerve damage to his ankle. Riley was treated for lacerations and minor hypothermia. They were declared physically fit, psychologically traumatized, and granted indefinite leave. 2 days later, they met in a sterile, impersonal diner 50 miles outside of Blackwood, a place loud with the clatter of plates, the hiss of the grill, and the drone of daytime radio. They sat in a booth by the window, both picking at untouched food. They bought it, Riley said, stirring her coffee. The sound of the spoon against the ceramic mug made Elias instinctively tense. They had to, Elias replied, his voice barely audible over the jukebox. No one else saw the machine. No one else knows about the code. The files are gone. The evidence is burned. The silence is contained. Riley looked at him, her eyes wide and haunted. Is it, Elias? I keep hearing it. Not the clicking. But the whirring. That high-pitched sound before the entity collapsed. It's constant. Like my brain is still looking for the noise that isn't there. Elias nodded slowly. He understood. He carried the same phantom limb of sound. He couldn't sleep without leaving the television on at maximum volume, yet the moment someone spoke too loudly, his entire body seized up, ready for the attack. That he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, sealed evidence bag. Inside were 2 items, one of the pristine, dark wooden wrens and the remains of the shattered hard drive. I kept one, he confessed. And the drive. We need to study them. We need to know where the code originated, or if it can transfer again. No, Elias, Riley whispered, leaning forward, her face pale. We need to get rid of them. The code might be gone, but the rule is still in the air. We destroyed the machine, but we didn't destroy the code's goal. It hunts noise. And we are the loudest people in Blackwood now. Elias looked at the hard drive, then at the wooden wren. He understood the danger. They were now survivors who knew the rules of the silence, and that knowledge made them targets. That he remembered a final, chilling detail from Miller's fragmented logs, a recurring note that the code seemed to fear being exposed to the raw, chaotic energy of the outside world, the random, uncontained noise that the precinct was built to filter out. We can't destroy the wren, Elias said, placing the bag back into his pocket. It's the only proof. But we can't stay here, Riley. This town is silent, waiting for the code to return. We are too loud for Blackwood. He pushed his chair back, the harsh scrape of metal on linoleum making a customer at the next booth glare at them. Elias flinched, but pushed past the discomfort. We leave Blackwood. We keep the wren. We keep the silence. But we make noise everywhere else. Riley watched him, then slowly stood up, mimicking his sudden, necessary movement. Where do we go, Elias? Elias looked out the window at the distant highway, a constantly flowing river of traffic, horns, sirens, and the roar of engines.